Wolfsonian, Florida International University. My name is Michael Hughes, and I'm subbing for a little tiny bit for Nancy Liebman, who was to introduce our speaker today. But Nancy must be running behind, and I just wanted to, first of all, welcome you. I love the theme this year. Shiros is really terrific. I wanted to share a quote with you that I had seen forever and ever in our galleries. This particular painting's been on loan to the Smithsonian. It's in the National Portrait Gallery now. But it says, "Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates." It's one of the Proverbs. And the artist, a woman named Evelyn Rumsey Carey, had painted it to be the suffrage, the sort of depiction of women's suffrage. And it's really terrific that we have this lineup of speakers today to reflect upon Shiros and the right of women to vote for the past 100 years. And so this morning, what I wanted to do is lead off, and we're going to certainly start with Cover Girls, a talk by Dr. Alison Fraunhar. Am I saying that correctly? She's a professor emeritus from the Department of Art and Design at St. Xavier University in Chicago. In Miami, we'd say Javier. It's on view on the fifth floor. An on view on the fifth floor are works by an artist that is well known for his visual works and publishing, but maybe less well known by name. His name is Conrado Massaguer, and he played a major role in shaping early 20th century Cuban visual culture through his influential magazine Social and Carteles. And Dr. Fraunhar will explore how he and his colleagues at once glamorized recognizably Cuban women and offered critique of Cuba's social conditions. And after the talk, I invite you to go upstairs and see the exhibition. If you had joined us for the talk, we'll allow you to go in free, but do stop at the box office, pick up a sticker so you can go upstairs and the guards won't question you. Anyway, Dr. Fraunhar has researched and written about Cuban art since her first trip to Cuba in 1997, and sits on the editorial board of the journal Cuban Studies, which I did a little bit of looking yesterday. That looks quite interesting. Her research and writing interests have centered on issues of race, gender, and representation of Cuban popular visual culture, art, and cinema. Her recent book is Mulata Nation, Visualizing Race and Gender, was published by the University of Mississippi Press in 2018. And she's recently co-curated an exhibition in cultural exchange called Cross Currents, which debuted at the Smart Art Museum in 2019. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Fraunhar to the Wolfsonian. Thank you.
Good morning. I want to start by thanking everybody for showing up on a beautiful Saturday morning. And I want to especially thank the Wolfsonian for inviting me here today. It has been my privilege and my pleasure to have a relationship with the Wolfsonian Library for more than 20 years, researching the magazines I'll be talking about today. Over the years, Chief Librarian Frank Luca and his staff have been unfailingly supportive and helpful in working with the collections and the facilities our researchers' dream come true. I found many of the images included in my book, and many of the images I will be showing today in its magnificent collection. I also want to give my deepest thanks to Vicki Gold-Levy for the wonderful exhibition that Michael just mentioned, Cuban Caricature and Culture, the Art of Massaguer, on view here at the Wolfsonian. And her collection of Cuban ephemera is an unsurpassed treasure and a source of inspiration to me and many other scholars and aficionados. Vicki is that rare collector who is guided by originality, a great sense of curiosity, and an instinctive eye for what's important. Her love of Atlantic City, Miami, and Cuba have led her to amass world-class collections that are crucial for historians and the interested public, and she generously makes them available. Over the years, conversations and collaborations with her have been invariably stimulating and enriching. I was glad to help in her preparation for this exhibition, and I'm delighted to participate in this program. I begin with the cover illustration from this 1934 issue of Carteles. This cover shows a mulata rumbera, the archetypical Cuban woman of mixed African and European heritage, dancing a rumba, the quintessential Cuban dance, itself a hybrid of African and European elements. The dancer is seen in 3/4 view. Her body extends at a slight diagonal across the center of the composition, leaning as she sways to the rhythm, holding a bright red sash to accentuate the movement of her hips. Behind her on the right side, giant banana leaves mirror the curve of her back, and on her left side, the shadow of an otherwise unseen maracas-shaking musician slides down the wall and onto the ground where it joins the mulata's shadow. Unexpectedly, the shadows are a light mauve, not much darker than the woman's skin color. The ground upon which these light shadows fall is dark blue. On it, the light shadows create a sophisticated negative image, a playful and abstract touch that reveals the elegant style of the artist Villalba. The magazine masthead lettering is also incorporated into the depth of field and the design, with the C behind the maraca shadow and the E and the S in front of the banana leaves, destabilizing the pictorial plane. As we'll see later in this presentation, weaving the magazine logo into the image is a signature design strategy for Carteles covers, and one rooted in the history of Cuban graphic arts, going back to 19th century mariquillas cigarreras, the humble cousin of illustrious cigar boxes, and broadsheet newspaper mastheads. Sophisticated, elegant, economical in line and gesture, this image neatly fulfills a particularly Cuban sense of modernity, including elements of tropical sensuality, rhythm, and racial hybridity. It is up to the minute, stylized, stripped of unnecessary embellishment, nimbly incorporating Art Deco conventions in a Cuban vernacular of dance, woman, music, and tropical foliage. It produces, in essence, a Cuban alternative vision of modernity with the mulata featured front and center. Conrado Massaguer, who is the subject of the exhibition Cuban Caricaturing Culture, did not create this illustration, but he published and indeed co-founded with his brother several magazines, most notably Social and Carteles, upon whose cover this artwork appears. Massaguer also ran a graphics agency that represented the top illustrators and designers in Cuba, who he then hired to design the covers of the magazines he published. Vertical integration. And at least for a time, actively supported progressive political initiatives. In this talk, I acknowledge Massaguer's importance as an artist and illustrator, and I also consider his role as an impresario fostering gifted artists and shaping 20th century visual culture. Massaguer's extraordinary vision and influence is evident in the art and design work he patronized and shaped through his publications. Outside of Cuba, Conrado Massaguer is best known for his caricatures such as Doble Nueve. Oops. Try as hard as I might, I can never get my slides in the right order, so bear with me. Doble Nueve, which is on view in this exhibition, shows a cool and confident FDR partnered with Winston Churchill, who you'll notice is holding the winning tile, a doble nueve, the most valuable tile in dominoes. Playing a game of dominoes against a queasy, pallid Hitler and sweaty Mussolini. You may also notice Stalin behind Churchill and the Emperor Hirohito behind Hitler. Massaguer thus neatly maps out geopolitics and personalities in the Second World War. It was allegedly the most widely distributed image during the war, and you can see why. Easily legible, capturing the dynamic of political alliances and political fortunes, lively and humorous. There's also a quality of lightness to the image. It gives no indication of the grim reality of the war for millions of civilian refugees, victims, and soldiers. This lightness is a characteristic of Massaguer's worldview and his style. It literally treats war as a game, which was a widely employed metaphor of the era. But the piece that fixes the image for me is that the game is dominoes. It's not just a game, it's the most Cuban of games, to this day played everywhere on the island. Massaguer managed to weave Cuba into the most crucial world events of the day. Let's see, where am I? In the US, Massaguer was known for caricatures and illustrations of illustrious Americans published in the many US magazines that he contributed to, and also perhaps his Masa Girls, generic if insipid girls inspired by Charles Dana Gibson's Gibson Girls. So you can see that over a generation, the style the illustrator style had really sort of moved on from a sentimental turn-of-the-century image to Massaguer's thoroughly modern women. And this para gusto se han hecho colores sort of loosely translates to there's something for everyone. In the early decades of the 20th century, women were increasingly portrayed as autonomous and spirited, whether the party-loving flapper, the automobile-driving independent woman, or the financially independent working girl. Massaguer enthusiastically depicted these modern women, but also deployed the feminine form and face in more conventional and static ways as well. Many carteles and social covers feature female figures and faces, demonstrating the insatiable appetite for, basically, pictures of women. This strategy carried over to Massaguer's imagery for the tourism industry. Massaguer in this image, along with many others I'm showing, is on view, an original copy upstairs. So if you haven't seen the exhibition yet, you will really have a treat in store. Massaguer was instrumental in developing the image of Cuba for the Cuban tourist industry that helped establish a fantasy image of Cuba in tourist imaginations. The fantasy was based on the trifecta of rum, cigars, and gorgeous available women, covertly packaged in wholesome outdoor activities such as boating, tennis, and golf. So you see this señorita who holds the abanico, the fan, and on the fan are depicted silhouettes of sports and leisure activities, and what else? What are these little things? Cocktails, right? This was prohibition, and it was a real selling point for the development of the tourist industry that you could party. In this cover design for the American magazine Life, I am reluctant to make these comparisons, but I will go out on a limb and say that Life is more or less equivalent to Carteles, all right? It's more or less equivalent. As an illustrator, artist in Cuban publications, Massaguer is known for the elegant illustrations and caricatures that grace the covers of Social and Carteles and other popular national periodicals. In addition to his work as an artist, Massaguer made an important but less well-known contribution to Cuban visual culture as an impresario. Along with his brother Oscar, he created and published a number of shorter-lived magazines in addition to Social and Carteles. Many of these existed only for brief runs, such as this one, Havana, the magazine of Cuba, which was only published during the winter season for a couple of years. For 2 years. He also, and this is just a factoid or a fun fact, but he briefly published a magazine dedicated to boxing called Knockout. It was spelled Knockaut. And I don't have any pictures of that. I came across it in some archival crawl at once, researching another artist that Massaguer patronized, who was the art director of that magazine. So he was just constantly inventive and trying different magazine formulas throughout his career, but Social and Carteles were really his two premier magazines with the longest duration. Social, to contrast them, Social was an expensive monthly that catered to Cuban elites, and it is generally considered the most influential publication for art and design of 20th century Cuba. Carteles was the premier popular Cuban weekly magazine for graphic art. Both of them featured exquisite design, illustrations, and features on fashion, interior design, and celebrities. Social, a more highbrow publication with a much smaller circulation, presented more avant-garde art and design, often featuring leading contemporary artists. Carteles was tremendously influential across the island, especially among the middle and working classes, and it had a reach far beyond subscription or newsstand sales. Contemporary estimates claimed that every issue passed through 9 pairs of hands, guaranteeing a level of visibility and national consensus unimaginable for a publication today. As I'm sure you can well imagine, in the era before TV or digital media, magazines were the most pervasive visual medium. Movies may have been more prestigious and more entrancing, but could not be consumed at home, and therefore people had more limited access to them. Another element that contributes to Carteles' importance is precisely its visuality. Although Cuba had one of the highest rates of literacy in Latin America, a significant percentage of its population was still illiterate during the Republican era, and Carteles could be and was enjoyed for the pictures alone. This 1925 Social cover, which is upstairs, shows Massaguer's skill as a caricaturist as well as his political sensibility. In it, Massaguer's iconic bellboy is hanging a portrait of the newly elected president, Gerardo Machado, in a portrait gallery of previous presidents. Note the slack-jawed, imbecilic image of his immediate predecessors, Zayas y Alfonso. While the portrait of Zayas is indeed scathing, it is important to note that Massaguer is not criticizing a standing politician or government policy. He is instead endorsing the new government through his smiling portrait of Machado. Within 2 years of Machado's election, high hopes for reform were crushed by his increasingly repressive, dictatorial, and corrupt regime. When the editorial offices of Carteles were ransacked and destroyed by Machado's goons in early 1930, Massaguer quickly fled into exile, first to New York and from there to Paris. The historical record has actually been kinder to Zayas than Massaguer's savage caricature would indicate. In recent historical work, Zayas and his accomplishments have been reassessed in a positive light, and Machado's legacy as a corrupt strongman cemented. Although Massaguer's politics can best be described as middle of the road, he wholeheartedly endorsed individual freedom, particularly artistic and intellectual freedom. Prior to his exile, he had been a member of the avant-garde activist group Salon Grupo Minorista, the minority group. The group was comprised of Cuba's leading young intellectuals, artists, composers, writers, lawyers, doctors, and philosophers. It was active from 1923 to 1927. It was heterogeneous. Members represented a wide swath of political beliefs, but they were united in their belief of freedom of expression, national autonomy, and continental solidarity. In this caricature, Massaguer depicts fellow minoristas at a table where the group famously met for almuerzos sabáticos, Saturday lunches. Visiting foreign artists and writers, particularly those who had been victimized by dictatorial regimes in their own countries, as well as elder Cuban intellectuals, were invited to these lunches. Massaguer's self-portrait is included, and he captures himself in mid-caricature. I love that. He captures himself drawing a caricature. And I have, in the course of my research, come across a key identifying who all of the various people gathered are, but I did not include that here today because there are really only so many rabbit holes you could go down at once. I wanted to show you also the signature page of the Declaración del Grupo. The minoristas were disruptors. They sought to shake off the political passivity that had characterized intellectuals of the previous generation and jumped into activism with a manifesto called A Declaración, published in both Social and their own journal, the Revista de Avance, in 1927. While the Declaración was one of the most important documents of Latin American modernism, the group was already on the brink of disbanding when it appeared in print. And I want to highlight for you here Massaguer's signature as a signatory to the Declaration, and just briefly, this on the last page, they're like, against political dictators, against the forces of pseudo-democracy, in favor of improving conditions for farmers, the colonized, and workers of Cuba. So it was their rallying cry was this idea of freedom. The increasingly repressive regime of Machado drove many minoristas out of Havana and eventually out of the country. And by 1929, the group was no longer in existence. I'm always fascinated by Massaguer's involvement with the self-identified vanguard of vanguardia when his work so wholeheartedly celebrated the popular and the mainstream. It is an interesting example of the very thin line separating the avant-garde from the popular at this moment in Cuban culture. Perhaps Massaguer's political and ideological orientation is partly explained by his childhood experiences and his education. These included exile and boarding school in the US. The Cuban War of Independence from 1896 to 1899 sent many Cubans into exile, and a significant number of them landed in Mexico, principally Veracruz and Mérida, really right across from the eastern edge of Cuba. The Massaguers were among the Cubans who settled in Mérida. Young Conrado was sent to boarding school in the US, where his enthusiasm for US culture blossomed, and he began a pattern of extended stays abroad where he was exposed to international art and culture. His youthful experiences, particularly in the US, oriented him towards new ways of thinking in what we might call the American century. Notwithstanding Cuba's hard-won independence from Spain, during the first 3 decades of the 20th century, much of Cuban culture was distinctly conservative, gazing backwards to the glory and the mores of the dwindling Spanish Empire. The US educated Massaguer and a few others instead looked north to the US for models of business, culture, and lifestyle. I sketched out here some of Massaguer's life experiences, interests, and activities to suggest that they played a role in his decisions and strategies as publisher and art director of key magazines. Depictions of femininity, North American influence, and forward thinking characterized his editorial choices. Massaguer hired the most prominent, established, and up-and-coming Cuban artists and illustrators to design covers and editorial art, as well as advertising for his magazines. I want now to highlight 3 cover artists in particular: Jaime Valls, Villalba, and finally Andres, whose elegant style would become virtually synonymous with Carteles aesthetic. These artists and others created an indelible style, combining elements and aesthetics of international graphic styles with uniquely Cuban elements. In particular, it was their images of women, especially recognizably Cuban women, that brought to life the conditions and contradictions of life in mid-century Cuba. Of these artists, Jaime Valls was the oldest. A contemporary of Massaguer, throughout the teens and 20s, he was more successful and more highly regarded as an artist than Massaguer was in Cuba.
There's supposed to be a slide.
No, actually, this is just the reading part, but thanks for keeping me focused. His early renown came from his advertisements for automobiles. In this ad for Packard, Valls' style seamlessly merges Edwardian Art Nouveau elements like filigree. Notice the bubbly background and the potted plant borrowing heavily from Aubrey Beardsley, and the dynamic diagonal lines suggestive of the sleek power and speed of a new century and the luxury automobile itself a novelty of this new century. The image still reflected an elegant but somewhat conservative style at this point in his career. This is sometime, I don't know if there's any guys in here who are car specialists who can tell me what year this model is from, but I'm just...
1918.
Does it say?
Right on top. 1918.
Well, thank you. I didn't see it this big before. Yeah, I knew it was before the 20s, however. Valls was a man about town, frequently sighted around Havana in a new car with a beautiful woman on his arm. However, before you write Valls off as a conventional conservative illustrator and frivolous playboy, in subsequent work he started exploring more Cuban themes in his characteristically elegant style. He began to express an interest in lo cubano, what is typically Cuban, in work like this soap advertisement that featured a rear view of a voluptuous mulata. While the woman is sexualized, she is also modern and a consumer, a citizen of the modern world of the nation with agency, not merely a sight for the male gaze. The mulata and the shopkeeper additionally represent a recognizably Cuban motif, this kind of Gallego Spanish shopkeeper and the mulata in the street expressed in Valls' elegant style. Next, Valls takes the figure of the mulata one step further, experimenting with this Afro-Cuban female body in motion across a range of media and outlets. So I show this image in this set of 3 images, all depict sensuous, graceful Afro-Cuban female figures dancing. The first, a painting, the second, a cover illustration for a mass market magazine, and the third, an illustration that appeared in Revista de Avance, a small circulation avant-garde journal that I previously mentioned was the journal of the Grupo Minorista. So Valls translates this figure from fine art to popular visual culture to the avant-garde, really making my point about how artists and images and ideas really percolated, really circulated throughout the culture. In the 1920s, and these are all from late 20s, early 30s, prior to this, Valls had spent time in Paris where he was introduced to latest experiments in figural abstraction, not going completely abstract, but really taking the figure beyond a merely representation. He took these ideas back to Cuba and applied them in his illustrations and artwork, work that was increasingly drawn from the experience of lived life on the island and not the iteration of generic foreign ideals. So this is slightly unfair, but I feel like in contrasting Valls' live dancing figures, Villaba's Rumbera looks rather stiff, but where the figure is restrained, the interplay of light and shadow in the composition is sophisticated and complex. During the 1920s and 30s, a shift took place both in politics and in style. When Valls traveled to Paris in the 1920s, when Massaguer did in the 1930s, they saw how European artists like Pablo Picasso were inspired by and incorporated elements drawn from African art into modernism. Massaguer, Valls, and other Cuban artists who came in and out of Paris in between the world wars began to appreciate more fully the African contribution to Cuban culture and to discover how this contribution was what made Cuban culture distinctive, unique, and authentic. Massaguer had fled the island under threat by the dictatorial Machado, and although Machado's ouster did not bring the much desired political stability to Cuba, it did allow Massaguer to eventually return to Havana and resume his career there. He continued working as art director of Carteles and even contributing artwork while in Paris in the early 1930s. And it was so the story goes, in 1932, a new artist arrived at the magazine. I am like, that's the official thing, but I don't think so because I have not seen any artwork of this artist before 1936. So this remains to be seen. Stay tuned. Just 16 years old, from the provinces with Holguin, with no formal art education when he began contributing drawings to the magazine. Andrés García Benítez, or simply Andrés as he was known from then on, burst onto the magazine's pages, becoming in 4 years the primary cover artist, a position he would hold for 30 years. He produced the vast majority of its covers and became synonymous with the look of Carteles, so wait for your mind to be blown. Wow! We became a really big leap in a short period of time. And I'm going to show now a series of a few that he did in this really concentrated period in 1936 and 1937 that in many ways really have no precedent. Yes, it's the figure of the rumbera, recognizable in the bata de cola, the dress with the ruffles, but the style is absolutely unprecedented. So I'm just going to sort of run through the next few images just to kind of blow your minds a little bit. And then make a few comments. It's possible that Andrés' bold vision can be attributed to his youth because he was only in his teens when he created these magnificent images. Perhaps his lack of formal training also played a role in his unique style. Not having learned the rules, he didn't have to unlearn them, right? As an untrained, provincial young person, albeit one with immense talent and drive, His vision of how things should be portrayed and how they should look was perhaps less mediated by conventional expectations of composition and proportion, and perhaps closer in feeling to the experience of everyday life, yielded an absolutely original and at the same time perfectly adapted visual language. Subsequently, Andres' style became more conventionalized, still graceful and eloquent, but less edgy. See, isn't that crazy? It's like he dials it back in a couple of years. Still graceful and elegant, but less edgy. And with little variation, it would remain this way for the rest of his career. The explicitly sexualized image was one of the few ways that women of color at the time in Cuba were depicted. Indeed, to this day, the image of the sexy mulata is used in tourism advertising and as cultural currency on the island. This image reflects specific conditions of Cuba, the tremendous influence of African culture and customs, and the problematic relations of sex and gender. Both of these were fostered by the slavery system that tolerated the forced sexualization of Black women through rape and chattel slavery, while at the same time exalting the image of white purity. We can see a shift from Massaguer's very Spanish señorita on the 1929 life cover to Andres's exuberant Black and brown figures from a few years later. In the 20s and 30s, as white Cuban artists and writers were discovering Cuban identity, they incorporated African rhythms, language, spirituality, and musical forms as important elements of Cubanidad or lo cubano. But very few actual artists, writers, or musicians of color were able to participate in or benefit from the celebration of their cultural contribution. Notwithstanding this exclusion of Afro-Cuban citizens and inclusion of Afro-Cuban culture, the degree of visibility of Afro-Cubans was unparalleled at this time. Afro-Cubans were depicted as citizens of the modern everyday life of the nation. Andres depicted not only Black women or mulatas, he produced many carteles covers serially portraying idealized white women in seasonal color schemes and leisure activities. In Andres's covers of the 1930s, women of color were not portrayed skiing or at the beach, as were white women. And I feel like this image always gets a laugh because the notion of skiing seems so improbable in a tropical nation. I want to almost defend the idea that Cubans saw themselves as citizens of the world and desired and aspired to the same kinds of lifestyle that people in other places did. So why not incorporate that into their own national imagery? But Afro-Cuban women were portrayed as smart, problem-solving modern women, even if they were also portrayed as victims of choteo, the uniquely Cuban form of satire in which the pretentious, from foreign visitors to politicians to elite society, were taken down a peg. In this cover, which exemplifies choteo, the smartly dressed young woman on the right is startled by the angry squawking rooster on the left, whose tail feathers she has plucked to adorn her stylish hat. Two women in the background in humble house dresses laugh at her literally behind her back. If we divide the image laterally in half, the right side would yield a picture of an elegant young woman, but the narrative punch of the scene is delivered by reading it from right to left. Like Massaguer, Andres favored a breezy, generous style that celebrated the conditions of everyday life, emphasizing charm and humor over stark images of human mystery and injustice. Unlike Massaguer, Andres was not so interested in depicting the shenanigans of the wealthy and the bourgeoisie. Among his myriad themes we find, in no particular order, baseball, domesticity, public transportation, leisure activities, romance, the school year, holidays, tourism, religion, scenes that can be classified as folkloric, fashion, beauty, world travel, all treated with his signature light touch. While this range of subject matter yields an encyclopedia of the everyday, encyclopedic popular visual imagery is not unprecedented in the history of Cuban illustration. During the third quarter of the 19th century, roughly from 1850 to 1875, the Marquilla Cigarreras, small illustrated papers that wrapped bundles of cigarettes for sale, functioned in a similar manner. They were inexpensive, widely available, widely seen windows into the world of stories, humor, knowledge, and practical skills. But that's a whole other image world. For example, this May Day was a very popular holiday in Cuba, and this cover from May Day in 1951 is really the only self-portrait of Andres that I've ever seen. And you just see him up at the top with his boca abierta, mouth open, the cartoonist at his desk, and his paintbrushes are angrily pointing to the calendar to tell him he should knock off work because it's May Day, the International Day of, celebrating work. The paint pots are already happily resting. So I like to include this just because he, unlike Massaguer, did not include his own image in the work that he produced. So this Carteles image of Andres from the previous year depicts La India stepping off of, this is the photograph of it, stepping off the plinth for her day of rest on May Day. It also gave me an opportunity to sneak a marquilla in, because this is an example of a marquilla that also depicts the Indian leaping off the fountain with an appropriate sort of political comment. Finally, they're going to wash us, and clean house. I don't know if you guys noticed, but this is completely baffling to me. The statue is obviously a woman. Andres' illustration is a woman. And the marquilla, it's a male figure. So that always strikes me. They did whatever they wanted. That's the only explanation I come up with. I also wanted to point out to you, this is a great opportunity to point out that when I mentioned earlier that this very elegant masthead lettering style had a 19th century precedent, this was what I was thinking of. The company name, La Honradez, the brand name, the company, has their logo that runs across the border of the marquilla with these lively interwoven figures and banners. And if you look really closely, you may notice that the figures are distinctly Asian looking. They represent the Chinese coolie laborers that had started to come into Cuba with the abolition of slavery in the late 19th century. So Cuban designers and illustrators have never lacked the ability to pack a tremendous amount of visual information in a small space. And just to give you a sense of scale, I wanted to show this is a fantasy image, but it's an image of a marquilla wrapping a bundle of cigarettes. So you could visualize this paper is small enough, cigarettes, and they didn't use cigarette rectangular packs like here, to wrap a bundle of cigarettes. You see here the emblem, the emblema, which gives you a sense of how the marquilla functioned. They're tiny. There was an amazing collection of them in the Biblioteca Nacional in Havana that was, and I was having a conversation with someone earlier about decimated archival resources in Havana. That collection of marquillas disappeared out the back door over the years. There are a few published volumes of them. You can find once in a while an original, but none of the really iconic ones. So just a research side note. India, marquillas, and if you think I can go on about magazine covers, you should hear me talk about marquillas. I wanted to point out that I've emphasized the link between these two popular graphic modes rather than the link between the magazine covers and fine art, which might seem more obvious. But I'm making a point, which is that while we might consider fine art, painting, sculpture, things we find in museum collections, to bear the meaning of art and human achievement, the visual art that touches people's lives comes in humbler packages, and it's found in the world around us. As Cuban caricature and culture and Vicky Goldbaby's collections aptly demonstrate, illustrations, caricatures, advertising images, cigarette wrappings, and other packaging, all the graphic images that surround us have tremendous power to entertain, inform, delight and show us who we are in the world we live in. I wanted to briefly show some additional images from Carteles to illustrate the themes that I mentioned earlier. So the theme of religion, this is a depiction of La Virgen de la Caridad, the patron saint of Cuba. You notice her skin color, she's always depicted as mulata, which is another reason why she is so strongly identified with Cuba and Cuban identity. Of course, Jesus is still white, but and she is depicted, as the Virgin of the Apocalypse, which is characteristic depiction of this virgin. But you notice the little tres angelitos, the little angels under her feet. The myth of the founding of the Virgen de la Caridad de Cobre is that there was a statue of the Virgen de Caridad floating around in the Bay of Nipe during a big storm. There were 3 little boys out in a rowboat. They found the statue and she guided them to safety. Nipe is way on the far eastern side of the island near Santiago. And not in this image, but in the original telling of the legend, one of the little boys are all named Juan. They're the tres Juanes. One is black, one is native, and one is white. So it's a foundation myth that kind of covers all bases. So this amazingly lively narrative scene includes both domesticity and baseball, 2 centers of Cuban life. The 2 main teams in Havana is Almendares, the Alacranes in blue from Almendares, and the Habanos in red. So this is basically Romeo and Juliet set in a Cuban middle-class household. The dad's Almendares, the mom's Habanos, and she's knitting. I'm sorry, it's Cuba. Why is she knitting? They don't need sweaters. But I love the big radio front and center in the middle of the image, the housekeeper in red and white, the colors of Chango, but also the colors of the Habanos.
We did wear sweaters.
Okay. Did people knit?
Yes, and crochet.
The crocheting I knew about, but in cotton, not. Thank you.
We did it, and because we needed a little bit of something warm or for winter time, because for us, 50 was cold.
Right.
It's different here in the north, but I just want to make
Thank you very much, I appreciate it. So you see the housekeeper dressed in the red and white of the Habanos, which is also the colors of Chango, holding, what is she holding? She's holding the statue of the Virgen de la Caridad, praying. The young couple, there's a real Romeo and Juliet moment in the background where love conquers all. The kids in the front also duking it out. So this circular image, I love the composition, the way the image just sort of circles around and packs so much humorous, but yet very authentic information. Romance. This cover from the 1940s depicts a sailor, an American sailor, on a date with a young woman who is very sentimental over, we can only assume, a bolero on the jukebox. The presence of the American military in Cuba was a very fraught fact for many, many Cubans. The American military did not always behave very well. Surprise. But there were others like Massaguer and other business people who were very keen on America and on continued relations with America. I think for me, one of the things I really like about this image is that it normalizes the depiction of people of color in a way that would have been unthinkable in other publications at the time. So they can be on a date, it can be comic that the guy is frustrated, the girl is sentimental. It's not a big deal, right? They don't have to be folkloric because they're people of color. This idea of relations between the 2 countries was never far from Cuban minds then, and it isn't today. So again, this kind of stereotypical señorita between the 2 flags with a cocktail. Tourism was also a theme that appeared frequently on Carteles covers. Particularly, it's kind of like Choteo. They're kind of making fun of straight-laced Americans cutting loose, you know, on the island, but it's pretty good-natured. One of the few kind of somber images, I would say, by Andres depicts a very generic, elegant lady with a gas mask on to remind us of the conditions of the war, far from the shores of the island as they may have been. Cuba was nonetheless, you know, very interested in those conditions. And interested in the world in general. We have the Cuban guajiro with his guayabera and straw hat and his cocktail, admiring a painting of can-can dancers in Paris, right? And in this cover, which I sort of teased, which was a teaser earlier, I wanted to show again this almost timeless image of the mulata that goes back to the 19th century. A beautiful mulata in a bata de cola, the roughly dressed, on Valentine's Day, being followed by suitors. One is sort of, you know, Gallego-looking Spanish guy with a big box of candy and a Valentine, and behind him, what? Un Chino, a Chinese, Cuban, holding a big basket of flowers and a Valentine with Cuban lettering on it. So really, Andres managed to really incorporate all these elements of Cuban society in this very playful way. And again, a very late image from Carteles of another American serviceman, again, in an interracial dance, which causes no consternation in Cuba. Very noteworthy, in my opinion. One of the only other abstract images that Andres did towards the very end of his run is beautiful abstract images of women in bikinis. And finally, if you note the date, it's July 15th, 1959, literally months before Fidel rolls into Havana and everything changes for good. This theme, and you wonder what Andres was thinking and what was people's consciousness. You know, the young mother with the very conventional bata de cola, and again, a Chinese frutero, you know, a fruit seller, gazing at her admiringly as she goes home. So it's this classic vision of Cuba that's on the verge of changing forever. Thank you very much.
If anyone has any questions, we have about 10 minutes per question. And also, as a reminder, I don't know if you mentioned this, Allison, but Allison's book is available for sale in our design store. And we encourage everyone to pop up to the 5th floor to see the Massaguer store. So if anyone has any questions for Allison, she'll be around for about 10 minutes.
Was about what is the contemporary re-evaluation of these magazines in Cuba. So the magazines featured a surprising amount of reported content. Like they always had serial stories, fiction that was generally from North American and Spanish writers. They often included some poetry. They had sports reported, both international and national. There were always photo layouts of visiting celebrities from abroad, from the world of entertainment, politics, and sports who were visiting Cuba. There was usually a feature story of national interest, perhaps a profile, a lot of entertainment celebrity coverage. Fashion, interior decorating, cooking, there was a crossword, a lot of great advertising illustrations. I was telling somebody before the talk that when I worked at the research here and Frank and Nikki would bring me boxes of copies of magazines, instead of being a diligent researcher focusing on the covers, I'd spend whole afternoons just kind of spacing out and reading the magazines cover to cover. So they were mainly black and white inside though. And
Were they like a
color.
Saturday Evening Post? Was that sort of the way they were?
You know, I want to, I try to resist making too many comparisons because then that always frames Cuba as copying America, which I'm trying to avoid. I would say more Life magazine than Saturday Evening Post, which was a bit more serious. The magazine that might have been closer like to time was Bohemia, which I did not talk about today because there was too much. Bohemia was more political and less graphic, less visual. That was Massaguer's aim.
Carteles tried, they were political at one point, I think in the early 30s. They were
Not
never
for long.
involved. Not for long, but they were.
Well, yeah, I mean,
certainly
that was the period, that when the machadato was unsupportable to people.
Yeah.
And there's always sort of weaving through the graphics, but even in the 1930s, in the early 30s, there's a ton of completely apolitical stuff, covers and stuff. Today, I would say there's more interest among historians and scholars and collectors. As I'm sure you know, there's been a tremendous boom in the collection of all kinds of not only art, but ephemera and memorabilia. In Cuba, you go to Plaza de Armas, there's always guys selling old copies of carteles and stuff. There's some serious collecting and exhibition of the work of Andres, but so far, not so much internationally. Does that?
Nothing, how does Cuba look at this stuff?
Well, that's what I was just talking
So
about. Among historians and
among Cuban historians.
yeah, art historians, there's certainly people that they're interested in the history of graphics that know about this kind of thing. But and I would say the general population, a lot of people have tons of old magazines in the rafters of their house, of their abuelos and stuff, and so they're not unknown, but it's not on people's radar really.
Could you say anything about the kerchief, almost with the pointy ears?
Yeah, that's a very iconic, that women often wear their head like in a wrap, what we would call a wrap now. That was a very iconic style that came from slavery. That came from African women having to cover their hair in the days of slavery, and it sort of migrated from being a sign of, of slavery to being a practical and much more universal clothing form.
And do you know where he lived in New York, Massaguer?
Massaguer? I think on the Upper West Side, if I'm not mistaken. He lived in New York a couple different times, but he was pretty Broadway-centric.
In 1924, he actually honeymooned at the Waldorf
That's right, at the Waldorf
Astoria. He
Astoria.
established a publishing studio at the Waldorf Astoria. So he was doing very well for himself in the 20s. But when he returned as an exile in the 1930s, it was a much more hand-to-mouth existence. So yeah, very different economic circumstances.
Thanks, Frank. Question in the back?
Oh, okay. You briefly mentioned a magazine that I've never been able to get my hands on, so I was curious where you accessed it for the content. Avance?
Revista de Avance, it's in, U of M has it, and the Biblioteca Nacional, a couple libraries in Cuba have it, but U of M has it.
And the reason I asked this was my great-grandfather co-founded that, but I've never been able to see it.
Whoa.
To get my hands on a copy of it.
Whoa. I don't know if you're going to get your hands on a copy at U of M, but you can certainly see it.
So what was the content in that magazine? Was it similar to Carteles?
No, it was much more intellectual. It was essay-driven. Essays were on thought, on Cuban identity, on international themes. A lot of themes about, particularly in the hemisphere, sort of about overcoming the legacy of colonialism and imperialism and the problematics of being colonized and formerly colonized. A lot of fiction, poetry, some of it very experimental, always examples of artists, not only Cuban artists, but hemispheric artists. Diego Rivera was a big contributor, Miguel Covarrubias also. So it was a very pan-hemispherically open publication and really reflected the state of the art of intellectual thinking at the time. So in the Cuban collection at U of M is where you'll find it.
Thank you.
Sure. One more?
Yes, did he go into exile, like Massaguer?
No.
He stayed.
No, and in fact, what I didn't mention is that Andres, in addition to producing, I can't even tell you how many. Carteles published 52 times a year. Many years, he had over half of the covers. But he was a very active designer for theater, for posters, for other stuff. So he was insanely prolific. And as far as I know, his career had, I don't know much about his career, if anything, after the revolution, but he didn't go into exile to the best of my knowledge. There's an amazing coffee table book on Andres that was published either in Buenos Aires or Madrid a couple of years ago. I have found it on Amazon, but it's not really for sale in the US and it doesn't have English. It's not bilingual, the text is only in Spanish, but it's a great, very comprehensive book on his work, which I highly recommend if you can get your hands on a copy. Thank you.